Hi everyone, welcome back. Please subscribe, like, and share. Now, let's get into today's story.
I was grading receipts at my kitchen table, or pretending to, the way I'd trained myself to look ordinary for 6 straight years, when 3 men walked into my living room without knocking twice. My husband, Desmond, stood just behind them, refusing to meet my eyes, and I understood, in the first half-second of seeing his face, exactly what he'd done. "Sit down," one of the men said, not raising his voice, the specific calm of someone used to rooms going quiet the moment he spoke. "We just need some information from you. Nothing personal." I stayed exactly where I was, one hand still resting on a stack of grocery receipts, my mind moving considerably faster than my expression let on. "Information about what exactly?" I asked. "Your accounts," he said. "Your schedule. Anything that helps your husband settle what he owes Kaz." I looked at Desmond then, really looked at him, and I watched him fail to hold my gaze for even a second. "You told them where I keep my paperwork," I said quietly. "You told strangers where I sleep." "Angela, I didn't have a choice," he said. "Kaz was going to hurt me. I just gave them something else to focus on instead." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to sit with it in my own living room. My husband had traded my safety for his, certain that whatever they found digging through my life would simply be leverage against an ordinary woman with an ordinary government desk job. He had no idea that the name Kaz Delgado had been sitting inside a federal case file on my own laptop for the past 3 years. Before I tell you exactly what happened in the next 10 minutes, because it is, without question, the most dangerous night of my entire undercover career, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what these 3 men didn't know standing in my living room is going to matter enormously to how the rest of this unfolds. I folded my hands calmly on the table, buying myself exactly the amount of time I needed. "What exactly did Desmond tell you about me?" I asked. The man in front looked at Desmond, then back at me, something flickering behind his eyes that I recognized instantly. The specific look of men beginning very slowly to suspect they'd walked into something considerably larger than a simple debt collection. I had no idea, sitting at that table with receipts still spread in front of me, exactly how close these 3 men already were to a federal indictment. They had absolutely no idea I'd spent 3 years quietly building against every single person they answered to. I want you to understand something before I explain how I ended up sitting calmly across from 3 strangers in my own living room. Nothing about that stillness was performance. I'd spent 6 years training my body to stay motionless through moments considerably more dangerous than this one. I joined the DEA at 24, straight out of a graduate criminology program, drawn to the work less by ambition and more by a specific, personal history I rarely discussed. An older cousin lost to an overdose when I was 17, a death that reshaped permanently what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I want to walk you through what deep cover work actually requires, because I think people imagine it as something closer to what appears in films, dramatic, constant danger, rather than what it actually is. Years of patient, mundane relationship building, disguised entirely as an ordinary life. I met Desmond 4 years into my career, under my legal name, working a cover identity that involved a government logistics job vague enough to explain long hours and occasional unexplained travel without raising real suspicion. He knew me as Angela Marsh, compliance coordinator for a federal transportation agency, a job title designed specifically to be boring enough that no one ever asked follow-up questions. I fell in love with him slowly, the way people do when they're not looking for it, though I want to be honest that some part of me, even in those earliest months, understood the specific risk of building an actual marriage on top of a cover identity this deep. I made a choice early on that I've revisited many times since. I decided not to tell him the full truth, believing at the time that his safety depended on his ignorance considerably more than our marriage depended on his knowledge. For most of our marriage, that arrangement worked. Desmond never asked many questions about my schedule, my occasional unexplained absences, the specific vagueness with which I described my work. I understand now, with considerable hindsight, that his lack of curiosity wasn't simple trust. It was something closer to a man who preferred not looking too closely at things that made him uncomfortable. A pattern that, as it turned out, extended considerably further than just his marriage. I had no idea, in those early years, that the same instinct that kept him from asking real questions about me would eventually let him hide an entire secret gambling habit from me for nearly 3 years. I want to walk you through the case I'd been building for 3 years, because understanding its scope matters enormously to understanding exactly how much danger Desmond unknowingly delivered to our front door. Ques Delgado ran a mid-sized narcotics distribution operation across 4 states, laundering proceeds through a network of legitimate-looking businesses. Used car lots, a chain of laundromats, a small but real construction company. My case, 3 years deep by the time of that night in my living room, had already identified 9 of his lieutenants, mapped the majority of his laundering structure, and secured 2 confidential informants working from inside his organization. I'd spent those 3 years the way I'd spent most of my career, patient, methodical, building a case strong enough that when arrests finally came, they'd hold up completely rather than falling apart on a technicality. I was, by the timeline my supervisors and I had agreed on, less than 4 months from finalizing indictments against Ques Delgado's entire operation. What I didn't know during those same 3 years was that my own husband had quietly developed a gambling habit severe enough that he'd eventually turn to exactly the kind of underground lending operation Ques Delgado also ran alongside his narcotics distribution, a detail that connected my own home, in ways I hadn't anticipated, directly to the center of my own federal case. I want to walk you through how I finally discovered the debt, because the specific mechanics of that discovery mattered enormously to what happened next. I noticed, roughly 8 months before that night in my living room, that Desmond had grown increasingly anxious, distracted, prone to taking calls in the garage with the door shut, a pattern I recognized instantly, given my own professional training, though I initially assumed, painfully, that it might indicate an affair rather than what it actually was. I confronted him gently, for months before the men arrived at our house. He told me, finally, about a gambling habit that had started small, sports betting mostly, alongside some poker games with co-workers, and had slowly spiraled into debt considerably larger than he'd initially admitted. He told me he owed roughly $11,000. He did not tell me at the time who exactly he owed it to. I offered to help him address it properly, legitimate debt counseling, a structured repayment plan, even offering to cover a portion of it myself from our joint savings. He accepted the money. He did not, as I understood only much later, actually use it to pay off the debt he owed. I had no idea, handing him that check 4 months before the men showed up, that the debt had already grown considerably larger than $11,000. Or that the specific person he owed it to was a man my own federal case had been quietly building toward indicting for the past 3 years. You already witnessed the opening moments, the men walking in without knocking twice, Desmond's inability to meet my eyes, the specific, calm demand for information about my accounts and my schedule. I want to walk you through exactly what happened in the minutes that followed, because the choices I made in that room mattered enormously to keeping everyone in that house alive. What exactly did Desmond tell you about me? I asked again, my voice carrying the specific, practiced calm I'd built over 6 years of undercover work. The man in front, considerably younger than I'd initially assumed, glanced toward Desmond with a flicker of something uncertain. He said you work some government logistics job. Good salary, decent savings. Said if we squeezed you a little, we could get what he owes without anyone needing to hurt him directly. I want you to notice, the way I noticed in that exact moment, the specific cowardice embedded in that sentence. My husband hadn't simply failed to protect me. He'd actively redirected danger toward me, calculating, apparently, that my safety mattered less than his own. I kept my expression carefully neutral, running rapid calculations behind it. I understood, immediately, that these men were low-level enforcers, not core members of Kaz's inner circle. Useful information, given how carefully I needed to navigate the next several minutes without compromising 3 years of federal work in a single unguarded moment. I don't keep large amounts of cash at home, I said, which was true. And my accounts are federal payroll accounts, which means garnishing them without a court order would create considerably more legal trouble for whoever tried it than $11,000 is worth. I watched the younger man's confidence flicker slightly, some instinct telling him, correctly, that this conversation wasn't unfolding the way he'd expected. "You seem awfully calm for someone with 3 strangers in her living room," he said. "I've had worse nights," I said, which was also true, though not in any way I could explain to him. I want to walk you through the specific, quiet action I took next, because it mattered enormously to everything that happened afterward. Underneath the kitchen table, my hand had already found my phone, activating, through a sequence I'd trained myself to execute entirely by feel, a silent emergency alert directly to my supervising agent. A system built specifically for undercover agents facing exactly this kind of unexpected exposure. I had no idea, sending that alert, exactly how quickly backup would actually arrive, or exactly how much these 3 men were about to learn about who they'd actually walked in on. Once federal vehicles started arriving outside a house they'd assumed belonged to nobody more significant than a mid-level government employee's frightened wife. The first sign came roughly 6 minutes after I'd sent that alert. Headlights sweeping briefly across our living room curtains, gone as quickly as they appeared, though I watched the younger man near the window notice them too, his posture shifting slightly. "Someone's outside," he said, glancing toward the older man who'd been standing near Desmond the entire time. "Probably just a neighbor," Desmond said quickly, though I could hear the specific strain in his voice, the sound of a man realizing, slowly, that something about this night had already gone considerably differently than he'd planned. I want to walk you through the next 90 seconds carefully, because they mattered enormously to how this entire situation resolved without anyone in that room getting hurt. 3 additional vehicles arrived in quick succession, positioned, I knew without needing to look, exactly the way my training had taught me federal response teams position themselves around a residence with an active safety concern. The older man near Desmond finally spoke, his voice considerably less composed than it had been 10 minutes earlier. "What exactly does your wife do for the government?" he asked Desmond directly. Desmond didn't answer, because Desmond genuinely didn't know. I stood up slowly from the kitchen table, and I want to be honest about the specific relief I felt, finally allowed, after 6 years of careful invisibility, to stop performing an identity that had never actually been true. "My name is Special Agent Angela Reyes," I said. "Gah. I've been building a federal case against Cas Delgado's entire organization for the past 3 years, and as of about 90 seconds ago, every person currently standing in this room is now part of that case." I watched the exact progression of understanding move across both men's faces. Confusion first, then a specific, draining horror as they recalculated everything about the woman they'd assumed was simply frightened leverage against her husband's gambling debt. Desmond's reaction arrived a half-second later, his face going through its own devastating recalculation. Not just fear of the federal agents now entering our home, but the much slower, much more personal horror of understanding that his wife of 6 years had an entire identity he'd never once suspected existed. "Angela," he said quietly, "what are you?" "Someone who kept you alive tonight," I said, "despite the fact that you handed 3 strangers directions to our house instead of simply telling me the truth about how much money you actually owed, and to whom." The 2 men in my living room that night were arrested within the hour, their cooperation, once they understood the scope of the federal case now surrounding them, becoming considerably more valuable to my 3 years of work than either of them could have anticipated walking through my front door. I want to give you an honest account of what happened in the months that followed, rather than a tidier version than real life actually offered. The case against Cas Delgado accelerated considerably faster than my original 4-month timeline, the additional cooperation from that night's arrests providing exactly the kind of corroborating testimony federal prosecutors needed to finalize indictments against his entire organization, including Cas himself, arrested 11 weeks later without incident. Desmond and I separated within a month of that night. A decision that surprised almost no one who understood the full situation, myself included. I want to be honest about the specific layers of that ending. It wasn't only about the debt, or even primarily about the debt. It was about a fundamental breach of trust considerably larger than gambling. A man who'd chosen, when frightened, to offer up my safety rather than face his own consequences directly. He told me, in one of our final conversations, that he'd never truly believed the men would actually hurt me. That some part of him had assumed, foolishly, that they'd simply talk, gather information, leave without real incident. I want you to notice, the way I noticed sitting across from him that final time, Exactly how much that explanation revealed about the gap between us. He'd gambled with my safety the same careless way he'd gambled away $11,000, betting that consequences simply wouldn't materialize if he didn't look at them too closely. My case against Quez Delgado's organization concluded, formally, just over a year after that night in my living room. 14 convictions, a narcotics distribution network dismantled across 4 states, and a specific, professional satisfaction I allowed myself to feel fully for the first time in longer than I could remember. I've since transitioned into a training role within the agency, mentoring newer undercover agents on exactly the kind of long-term relationship management this work requires, including now considerably more honest conversations than I once had with myself about the specific cost of building an entire marriage on a foundation someone else never fully consented to. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who assumed your quiet, ordinary presence meant you were powerless, or safe to use as leverage, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who treat others as expendable, certain there will be no real consequences, are almost always operating with an incomplete picture of exactly who they're dealing with. They see a quiet job title, an unremarkable routine, a woman calmly sitting at her own kitchen table, and they act accordingly, without ever considering that the person in front of them might be watching, and building, considerably more than they could ever imagine. Desmond handed 3 strangers directions to our home, certain his wife's ordinary life made her safe collateral for his own mistakes. He had no idea, until federal vehicles lit up our living room windows, exactly who he'd actually married, or exactly how close his own recklessness had come to unraveling 3 years of work aimed at the very organization he owed money to.